Vladimir Nabokov is considered one of the most important writers of the 20th century. He rose to fame in 1955 with the publication of his controversial novel Lolita, a work that narrates the perverse attraction of a European teacher to certain types of minors whom he calls nymphets and his relationship with a 12-year-old girl. The book was heavily criticized for its subject matter, but was also praised for its highly elaborate prose and style, and was eventually ranked as one of the greatest literary works of the 20th century. Just enough to read some opinions about the novel. The Nobel Prize for Literature Mario Vargas Llosa described it as follows: among the most subtle and complex literary creations of our time. Which does not mean, by the way, that it is not a provocative book. Vladimir Nabokov was a literary critic with radical and forceful opinions. He expressed his ideas about literature without fear. The great author, considered one of the main figures of universal literature, did not seek to be liked but rather to make his judgment regarding other writers clear. In this way he clearly showed his contempt for authors considered great in literature. For example, he described Fyodor Dostoevsky as a third-rate writer, he disdained authors like Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, and he despised almost all the writers of his time. But before addressing a bit about the controversial opinions of Vladimir Nabokov, let's do a little review of his life and his work, to get to know this severe judge and critic better. Vladimir Nabokov was born in 1899 in St. Petersburg, Russia, belonging to an aristocratic family. His grandfather was Minister of Justice for two Tsars, and his father was a liberal opponent of the autocracy of Nicholas II. His family spoke Russian, English and French, so Nabokov spoke all three languages from a very young age. In 1919 his family went into exile in Germany for fear of the Bolsheviks, who seized power in Russia. He attended Cambridge University in England, and after finishing his studies he worked in various jobs as a farmer, crossword puzzler, tennis and boxing teacher. In the year 1925 Nabokov married Vera Evsevna Slonim, a Russian of Jewish descent, from whom he never separated and with whom he had a son. When World War II began, and after living in France, Vladimir moved to the United States, where he taught Russian literature at Wellesley University and later taught at Cornell University. Among the essays he wrote at this time, one on the Russian writer Nikolai Gogol, which was published in 1944. He became a U.S. citizen in 1945 and wrote some of his most famous books, such as The True Life of Sebastian Knight in 1941, or Lolita in 1955, his best-known work. He lived in the United States until 1959, and then he went to live in Switzerland. Vladimir Nabokov, who apart from being an excellent writer was also an expert on Lepidoptera, which are an order of holometabolous insects, almost always flying, commonly known as butterflies. He published Pale Fire in 1962 and Ada or Ardor, a family chronicle in 1969, books in which his characteristics as a writer stand out: formal perfection, social portraits full of ironic humor and a rich psychological description of his characters. He finally passed away in Montreux, Switzerland, on July 2, 1977, after suffering from pneumonia, at the age of 78. His magnum opus, Lolita, was as controversial as his views on literature. Initially, the work was rejected by various publishers, and ended up being published by a modest French publisher specializing in erotic literature. The work was quickly banned in England and France, however it eventually prevailed over the censorship and was published in the United States in 1958. Now that we know a little about the life and work of this writer and literary critic, let's see some of his opinions. About other Russian writers. Nabokov was not kind to the great Russian writers just because he was born in the same land, but was a harsh critic of several of them. He described Dostoevsky as a third-rate writer, a cheap, clumsy and vulgar sensationalist, and also said that the Russians revered him as a mystic and not as an artist. At the same time, he rated Turgenev's work as an A- and had some admiration for Tolstoy. About English-language writers. Forster's novels to be limited and boring, with old-fashioned and uninteresting characters, lacking in authenticity and naturalness in their storytelling. Ernest Hemingway and Joseph Conrad were for children, and at first he was against Jane Austen, but later he liked it. About some Nobel laureates. Vladimir Nabokov also expressed his contempt for some Nobel Prize-winning writers for literature. For example, he never liked the work of Thomas Mann, calling it a tower of the hackneyed. He said that the writer William Faulkner was horrible to him and that he was surprised that his Corn Chronicles could be called masterpieces. Also, he couldn't stand his regional literature and artificial folklore. Nor did he like Albert Camus or Jean-Paul Sartre, whose work had no value for the author of Lolita. What writers did Nabokov admire? But he also had admiration for others. Among his contemporaries, the only one who deserved his respect was Jorge Luis Borges, who he said he loved for his lucidity, his purity, and his poetry. He also had great respect for James Joyce, calling Ulysses a marvelous invention, in his opinion the best book of the 20th century. Although he was harsh on the Irishman's latest novel, Finnanang's Wake, he describes it as formless and obtuse, the cold filler of a book, a tragic failure and a terrifying bore. He also loved Kafka's Metamorphosis and the first half of Proust's fairy tale, In Search of Lost Time. Other authors respected by Nabokov were Samuel Beckett, Herman Melville, John Milton, Alexander Pushkin, among others. On the existence of God. At the end of an interview for Playboy, he was asked if he believed in God. To which the writer replied, "Being quite candid, and what I'll say next has never been said before and I hope will give you a healthy chill, I know more than I can put into words, and what little I can put into words wouldn't have been put if I hadn't known more." As he wrote. In the same interview for Playboy, they asked him about his way of writing, since it was said that he did it on foot and by hand. The answer was, "Yes. I never learned to type. I usually start my day at a lovely vintage easel in my study. Later, when I start to feel gravity in my calves, I sit in a comfortable chair and use a simple desk. Finally, as gravity begins to scale my spine, I settle back on the sofa in the corner of my small study. It's a pleasant sun routine. However, when I was young, in my 20s or early 30s, I could lie in bed all day reading and smoking. Now things have changed." About Freud. The writer was not a supporter of Freud, so he responded when asked about his opinion of it. "Freudianism and all that it has tempted with its grotesque implications and methods seem to me to be one of the vilest deceptions practiced by people towards themselves and others. I reject it completely, along with a few other medieval practices still adored by the ignorant, the traditionalist, or the very sick." When asked if he would return to Russia. In an interview made by Ingarin in Paris, they asked him if he would return to Russia, to which Nabokov replied, "No, to Russia, no, never. Russia is over for me. It's a dream I made. I invented Russia, and the dream went very wrong, was over." About his favorite language. In 1975, with the publication in France of his novel Ada ol Ardor, Nabokov gave an interview to Bernard Pivot for French television, and since the writer spoke French, English and Russian, he was asked which of these three languages he preferred. And his response was, "In the language of my ancestors I feel perfectly comfortable, but I will never regret my American metamorphosis. French, or rather my French, which is a very special thing, does not yield so well to the torture of my imagination. Its syntax prevents me from certain liberties that I take with the other two languages. It goes without saying that I adore Russian, but English surpasses it as a working tool. It surpasses it in richness of nuances, in delusional prose, and in political precision. A procession of English nannies and governesses comes to meet me as I return to my past." Always controversial, both in his work and his opinions, but his brutal honesty is something rarely seen today. This part of Nabokov forms a striking contrast to the butterfly-loving writer, who became fond of them from a very young age, and enjoyed going out hunting them with his wife. Here we conclude the review of Nabokov's opinions. I hope you liked the video, and if you want you can follow me for more content related to literature.